To truly grasp the scale of Solomon's temple, we must talk about the numbers. Not just ancient measurements, but the kind of wealth that would disrupt the global economy of today. When we say this was the most expensive project in history, it is not an exaggeration. It is a mathematical reality. The Bible, specifically the first book of Chronicles, provides an inventory that reads like a balance sheet for a superpower. From the national treasury, King David had set aside 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver. But that was only the beginning. From his own personal fortune, his private equity, he added another 3,000 talents of the finest gold from Ophir and 7,000 talents of refined silver. Now, let's translate those ancient talents into a language we understand today. In the ancient Near East, 1 talent weighed approximately 75 pounds, or 34 kilograms. When you do the math, the gold reserves alone totaled roughly 3,400 metric tons. At today's fluctuating gold prices, that sits at a staggering $493 billion. But Solomon didn't stop at gold. The silver reserves totaled over 34,000 metric tons, adding another $80 billion to the ledger. When you combine the precious metals, the gemstones, the bronze, and the iron, you are looking at a total raw material value of approximately $590 billion. To an American viewer, let that number sink in. That is more than the net worth of the world's 3 richest billionaires combined. It is nearly 40 times the cost of the Burj Al Bayt in Mecca, currently the world's most expensive building. Solomon was not just building a church, he was creating a physical manifestation of heaven's wealth on a hilltop in Jerusalem. But why so much? The answer lies in the sheer saturation of the materials. This wasn't gold leaf or thin plating. The Bible describes a sanctuary where the floors were overlaid with gold. The walls were lined with cedar and then completely covered in gold. Even the nails were made of gold. When the priests entered the inner sanctum, they weren't looking at stone or wood, they were encased in a box of solid, shimmering light. However, wealth of this magnitude creates a unique set of problems. You cannot simply walk into a market and buy 3,000 tons of gold. You cannot hire a local contractor to handle a $500 billion budget. Solomon had inherited the greatest fortune in history, but he was sitting in an agricultural nation of farmers and shepherds. He had the capital, but he lacked the industry. To turn this mountain of gold into a masterpiece, Solomon would have to look beyond his borders. He would have to leverage his wealth to hire the greatest maritime superpower of the age. But as we will see, when you spend this much money, you aren't just building a temple, you are changing the DNA of your nation forever. Solomon possessed a fortune that could buy the world, but he faced a geographical crisis. Israel was a land of olives, grain, and limestone, it was not a land of timber. For a project intended to be the pinnacle of human architecture, Solomon needed the steel of the ancient world, the mighty cedars of Lebanon. These trees grew over 100 feet tall, were naturally rot-resistant, and emitted an aroma that was considered the fragrance of royalty. But these forests belonged to King Hiram of Tyre, the ruler of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were the world's first maritime superpower. Their ships dominated the Mediterranean, and their craftsmen were the most skilled engineers on the planet. Solomon knew that to build a house for the divine, he needed to make a deal with the masters of the earth. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in the first book of Kings reveals a masterclass in ancient business. Solomon reached out to Hiram with a clear proposition: "You know that my father David could not build a temple because of the wars waged against him. But now, the Lord has given me rest. Command, therefore, that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me." Hiram's response was not one of charity, but of high-stakes trade. This was a 20-year economic treaty. In exchange for an unlimited supply of cedar and cypress wood, along with the services of a master architect named Hiram, Israel would become the breadbasket for the Phoenician Empire. Every year, Solomon sent Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat and 20,000 baths of pure olive oil. To put that in perspective, that is over 4 million liters of oil and thousands of tons of grain, annually, for 2 decades. But the logistics were even more staggering than the price. Picture the Phoenician lumberjacks high in the snow-capped mountains of Lebanon. They felled massive logs, some weighing several tons, and dragged them down to the coast. There, they lashed the timbers together into gargantuan rafts and floated them down the Mediterranean Sea to the port of Joppa. Now, imagine the sight at the harbor, thousands of massive logs bobbing in the salt spray. From there, they had to be hauled 35 miles inland uphill, rising nearly 3,000 feet in elevation to the rocky summit of Jerusalem. There were no cranes, no trucks, and no paved highways. Every inch of progress was bought with rope, sweat, and the raw muscle of thousands of men. Solomon had secured the materials and the alliance. The gold was ready. The cedar was arriving. But now, he faced the most controversial part of his grand design: who would actually do the back-breaking work? With the gold secured and the cedar arriving at the gates, Solomon faced a logistical challenge that would make a modern CEO tremble. He needed a workforce. Not just a few hundred laborers, but an army of men. To complete the temple, Solomon mobilized 183,000 people. To put that in perspective, the total population of Israel at the time was likely between 1 and 2 million. This means Solomon conscripted nearly 10% of his entire nation for a single project. In modern American terms, that would be like the U.S. government mobilizing 33 million people to build one structure. It was an unprecedented mobilization of human capital, and the way it was organized reveals a complex, and sometimes dark, hierarchy. According to the first book of Kings, the workforce was divided into 3 distinct tiers. At the top were 30,000 Israelites. These men were part of a rotating draft. They worked in the mountains of Lebanon for 1 month and then spent 2 months at home with their families. For them, it was a national duty, demanding, yes, but humane. But below them stood the true engine of the project: 80,000 stonecutters and 70,000 carriers. These 150,000 people were responsible for the most brutal labor, quarrying massive blocks of limestone and hauling them up the steep, jagged terrain of the Judean hills. Here is the detail many people miss: these 150,000 men were not Israelites. They were foreigners, descendants of the Canaanite peoples who had been conquered generations earlier. For them, there was no 1 month on, 2 months off rotation. They were under a system of permanent conscription known in Hebrew as mas, forced labor. It is a striking irony that the temple of the God who liberated Israel from Egyptian slavery was built, in large part, by slave labor. Overseeing this massive operation was a man named Adoniram, the minister of forced labor. He was likely the most hated man in the kingdom. He managed a network of 3,300 supervisors who ensured that the work never slowed, the stones never stopped moving, and the king's vision never faltered. As you imagine these 70,000 carriers, picture them in the blistering heat. Each man carries a basket of stone or pulls a sledge. There is no end date in sight. For the foreign laborer, the temple wasn't a symbol of spiritual glory, it was a symbol of their subjugation. This massive labor force didn't just build a temple, they planted the seeds of a revolution. Among the supervisors was a young, talented official named Jeroboam. He watched the exhaustion of the men. He heard the quiet resentment brewing in the quarries. He saw the heavy yoke Solomon had placed on the backs of the people. The temple was rising in magnificent silence, but the hearts of the workers were beginning to scream. Decades later, this very issue, the heavy yoke of labor and taxes, would cause the 10 northern tribes to rebel, splitting Solomon's united kingdom in two. The greatest building in history was being built with a human cost that would eventually tear the nation apart. Perhaps the most hauntingly beautiful detail of Solomon's temple is not its gold, but its sound, or rather, the lack of it. Imagine standing in the heart of Jerusalem during those 7 years of construction. You are witnessing the most ambitious architectural feat in the ancient world, yet as you approach the site, you hear nothing. No rhythmic clanging of hammers. No screeching of metal saws. No chisels biting into rock. The first book of Kings, chapter 6, verse 7, records a phenomenon that still leaves modern engineers in awe. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. How is this possible? And more importantly, why would Solomon impose such a bizarre and difficult restriction? The reason was deeply theological. In the ancient Israelite mind, iron was the metal of the sword. Iron meant war. Iron meant the shedding of blood. Since the temple was to be the dwelling place of the God of peace, Solomon believed that the tools of death should never touch the house of life. To bring an iron tool onto the Temple Mount would be to defile it. To achieve this, Solomon's engineers executed a strategy we now call prefabrication, but at a level of precision that is staggering even by today's standards. Every single limestone block, every cedar beam, and every golden fixture was measured, cut, and finished miles away at the quarries and workshops. The primary source for these stones was a massive underground cavern located directly beneath the city of Jerusalem, known today as Zedekiah's Caves or Solomon's Quarries. Inside these cool, dark tunnels, 80,000 men worked by torchlight. They used a unique type of limestone called melik, or royal stone. This stone has a remarkable property. It is soft and easy to carve while it is underground, but once it is exposed to the air, it hardens into marble-like durability. Working in these subterranean chambers, the stonecutters followed a master blueprint with millimeter tolerances. They didn't just cut blocks. They carved complex tongue and groove joints so that the stones would lock together by gravity and friction. When a block arrived at the temple site, it was like a piece of an ancient, divine Lego set. The workers simply slid it into its designated position. If a stone was off by even a fraction of an inch, it couldn't be trimmed on site. It would have to be sent back to the quarry. Yet, the biblical record suggests the assembly was seamless. Think about the coordination required. Without computers, laser levels, or standardized units of measurement across different teams, they achieved a perfect fit in total silence. The temple didn't just grow, it appeared, rising out of the earth as if by the hand of God Himself. It was a message to the world that the most powerful work of the divine is often done in the quiet, away from the noise of human ambition. After 7 years of labor and silence, the scaffolding was finally removed. What remained was a structure that redefined the limits of ancient luxury. But as magnificent as the exterior limestone appeared, it was merely a shell for the true wonder that lay within. To enter Solomon's temple was to leave the physical world behind and step into a realm of pure, golden light. The temple was designed as a progression of holiness. First, you would pass through the massive bronze pillars at the entrance, named Jachin and Boaz. Beyond them lay the holy place. Here, the floor was made of cypress planks, and the walls were paneled with cedar. But you would never see the wood. Every square inch was overlaid with hammered gold. The walls were not flat surfaces. They were carved with intricate reliefs of palm trees, open flowers, and cherubim, all encased in gold. 10 golden lampstands lined the hall, their flames reflecting off the metallic walls to create an environment that felt as though it were glowing from within. But at the far end of the hall stood the most sacred space on earth, the Holy of Holies. This was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in every dimension. It was a room of total, absolute gold. Inside, Solomon placed 2 massive cherubim, each 15 feet tall, their wingspans stretching from wall to wall. They were carved from olive wood and, once again, plated in gold. Then came the day of dedication. All of Israel gathered in the courtyard. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant, the chest containing the stone tablets of the law, into the inner sanctum. They placed it beneath the golden wings of the cherubim, and withdrew. At that moment, something happened that no amount of gold could buy. The Bible records that a cloud, the Shekinah glory, filled the temple. It was so thick, so tangible, and so overwhelming that the priests could not stand to perform their duties. The God who the heavens could not contain had chosen to inhabit the house built by human hands. For the workers who had spent 7 years in the dark quarries, for the carriers who had hauled stones uphill, and for Solomon who had spent his nation's fortune, this was the validation. The silence of construction gave way to the thunder of divine presence. Every talent of gold was justified. Every drop of sweat was redeemed. In the heart of Jerusalem, the line between heaven and earth had finally blurred. Solomon's vision was no longer a blueprint, it was a living, breathing reality.